Hi guys, good morning, good afternoon. Welcome to our webinar, 5 tips for efficient development on the Salesforce platform. I'm just going to give it a minute or two for people to start pouring in, and then we'll get started shortly. All right, guys, thanks again for joining. I'm Shannon, and today I'm joined with Scott Teeple, who is our Director of Customer Success here at Prodly, and Christine Marshall from Salesforce Ben. Before we get started, I'm sorry, wrong way. Before we get started, just a couple of housekeeping messages. You will all be muted, but you can always raise your hands. You can ask us any questions in the question chat during the webinar, and we'll take care of that in our QA portion. We'll be recording this webinar and we'll be sending that out tomorrow, the 18th. So I'd like to turn your attention to Scott and Christine. Scott?
Yeah, thanks, Shannon. So we're here to talk about, 5 tips of efficient development, and I think there's nothing worse than being presented with a PowerPoint presentation and we drain the slides and you kind of get bored and you're just like, hey, I'll just look at that video later. So we really wanted to make this more of a dialogue session. So Christine comes with a world of experience within Salesforce, and I'm really kind of representing our customer base, and kind of going to use this as a chance for me to be the voice of our customer and bring some tips to you. So our first topic is around structured change request process, and I think somewhere in the world of this dialogue we really got into DevOps and really focusing on the process of DevOps. But one of the topics that we like to talk about is not the subset of DevOps, but really the superset, if you will, of application lifecycle management. And one of those is the plan stage, right? We were talking about how the request actually comes in the process around that. And talking with a lot of our customers, we get various degrees of maturity when you think about using Excel as a tracking tool, all the way through using a very well established ITSM system and integration. So Christine, as we think about that varying degree of maturity, when you think about how our customers are really utilizing the change management, if you will, they come in from all kind of directions. How did you manage, those requests that were coming in from the business as it went through?
With great difficulty, without a proper tool, is the short answer. But to expand on that, I built a custom object within Salesforce to manage change requests from the business. So custom object, custom fields. I had things like priority, the efforts, the due date. It had some benefits for sure. I was able to use the native reporting and dashboards, approval processes, but it also had huge amounts of limitations because it relied on people having a Salesforce license. And typically my experience is that, especially at the sort of C-suite level, they may not actually always have a Salesforce license, and a lot of the requests were coming in from that level, and so they couldn't utilize this custom object that I had created. And I think it becomes more and more important because with the ever-growing range of clouds, of products, of features, the complexity that we have, managing your change requests becomes harder and harder.
No, and it's so critical. And I love the fact that you brought up, being able to capture the benefit, right? And as the request comes in, I think so many times as an IT director, right? Like, we really want to just get to solve it, right? We want to get to, hey, we understand the problem, let's actually get it in place. But there's no measurement, there's no way of coming back to, and I think if you include that within the requirements gathering itself, I think then it sets your stage up, right, your process to really come back, later for that key piece around value measurement and whatnot. So I think that is really critical, and I think there are an awful lot of tools that are out there, right? And I think building it within Salesforce is a great idea, but I think at the end of the day, whatever your ITSM system is, highly important to have sort of an integration. And I think we're going to touch on that in a little bit. So it's not, working separately between what would be your change request and all the other work when you think about application lifecycle management or DevOps, but really having a flow that kind of goes between those. But that kind of brings us up to maybe the second topic here, which is around, proper sandbox management strategies. So now that you've got the request, that's sitting in front of you. Now you got to go and actually create those environments to start doing that work, because let's face it, probably shouldn't be doing that work directly in production, right? Even though I think Salesforce might set you up for that, but that wouldn't necessarily be good, right? So we got to start thinking about what's the proper way for us to get an environment to have the sandbox that you need with the proper data, configuration data, metadata, all those different pieces. So can you think of an example of maybe when your sandbox strategies maybe didn't go so well as you think about that?
Absolutely. I think sandboxes are a complex topic, and I've had lots and lots of problems with sandboxes. I think the worst example I can share is I had been building in a sandbox some very complex automation and new processes, and it had been going on for months. We'd gone back and forth, and so we hadn't released the changes, and another admin refreshed my sandbox, unaware that I'd been building in it for a long time, and so we lost all of that work. And I think that becomes more and more the norm, again, as people have longer release cycles when they're building more and more functionality or complex functionality. And I know we're going to talk a little bit about branching and changes coming in from different areas. So actually the timeline for these changes to be released can become very, very long. And then you lose the benefits of sandboxes to some degree, because you can't refresh them without losing your changes. But the longer between refreshing, the more out of date things like your data are. So yes, it can be really tough, sandboxes, and having a proper sandbox strategy.
Yeah, so talking with our customers, we see anything from a really aggressive sandbox strategy, refresh of a month, right? Everything to a quarter to a year. But then we also have ad hoc, which means they can't really do it ever, right? Which isn't necessarily good. So I know that you're passionate about sandbox seeding. So why is it an important part of your sandbox strategy?
So sandbox seeding, I think, is something that's typically everyone thinks is just for developers, but actually it's for the entire Salesforce process. Whether you're an admin, a developer, an architect, everybody should be thinking about sandbox seeding. And the reason I think it's so important is we know we have multiple types of sandboxes. Not everybody has a full sandbox, and the full sandbox is the only one with a full copy of your data. Maybe you have a partial sandbox, but that's only some of your data. And again, depending on how long it's taking you to release things, that data may be out of date by now because you've been building in that for a while and haven't released those changes. And then you have things like your developer and your developer pro, which don't have any data in. And so I always think you don't want to use your full and partial sandbox unless you really have to. So we should be making use of developer and developer pro, but that means getting data in, and it needs to be relevant data. So you need to be able to select a set of data that you want to pull, and it has to be, you need to think about whether or not anything needs to be anonymized. You need it to be easy to get it into your sandbox. And it's not just for testing, but if you think about training, if you want to do any user training, you really need to train with data that they are familiar with. Otherwise, your training session ends up getting derailed by people saying that opportunity I created last week isn't here, or the opportunity I created a month ago is in the wrong stage. And it's just because it's old data. So I think sandbox seeding is really, really critical to be able to build and test and train on those changes effectively before they get into production.
Yeah, I almost think that this is a good maybe volleyball spike to me around Prodly, and what Prodly brings is automation around what you just described, because it is so painful for an organization to be able to do their sandbox strategies, right, and moving data around. But I think that there's fairly new process that Salesforce has released around Scratch orgs and being able to take advantage of those. And I know that we talked about this a little bit just around the advantage of Scratch orgs. But when you don't necessarily have what you need or the refresh that you can get to in your partials and your fulls, I think Scratch orgs are a perfect opportunity for you to get exactly what Salesforce gives you for free. The difficulties there is that you got to know command line. And you got to be able to figure that out, and they come empty. So you're right back to where you just talked about, well, they're kind of empty, so how do I get those? But what Prodly actually brings you is a kind of a one-touch Scratch org creation to actually seed and bring in the data that's relevant that you're talking about. So it's not as difficult as, hey, I've got to wait for developers to get done. I got to have a code freeze so I can do my refresh. I got to have a full refresh or a partial, and I hope that Salesforce brings the right data that I need. But I can actually see that exactly what I need with the use of Prodly. So I'm kind of excited about that piece. So.
Yeah, I love that, making Scratch orgs accessible to more people, as you say, that traditionally they're not accessible unless you're a developer.
Yeah. So the next topic we wanted to get into was around, the preparation for, monitoring and compliance. Could you talk a little bit about your experience here?
Absolutely. So I have been through an audit on multiple Salesforce orgs. I worked for a global engineering company that held a lot of sensitive data. They did work in things like defense and automotive engineering. And I felt completely out of my depth. The auditor turned up one day and someone delivered him to my desk and said,
"Is that how it always works?"
Yeah. It was, the heads up of 2 seconds was really useful. And luckily I had done some, I did have some documentation. And as I said, I built like a change request process into Salesforce. So I had really rough idea of, what's been going on, but I had to go away and find lots and lots more information on things like change logs and change requests and who was in charge of what and who owned different bits and pieces. And it was a very overwhelming experience. I think that is probably true for a lot of Salesforce professionals because we're not from a compliance background. And actually it's constantly changing, the compliance, the rules around it change all the time. And so it can feel like something that we just don't want to talk about. We don't want to deal with it. I know when I've spoken to other Salesforce professionals, they don't really have a full grasp on what needs to be there for auditing purposes.
Yeah, and I think this is where the conversation really shifts, right? When we talk about application lifecycle management, because we talked about plan before. You've kind of got the DevOps kind of in the middle, and now we're talking about monitor and what's the overall key aspects of monitor. And I think that where what I'm hearing from our customers a little bit more, specifically around Salesforce CPQ and Sales Cloud, is that because we're now dealing with pricing changes, we're talking about critical financial pieces of your organization, that it is actually becoming a part of a lot more external audit because there is some of that financial critical needs for audit. So it's interesting that we need to start making sure that we're understanding and that we have things in place that not only talk about the measurement of value that we talked about early on, so in the documentation at the requirement stage, but then tying the who to the what and to the why. So when you think about why the request is coming in, right? Having the user stories within your service management, but then actually documenting the overall process and who actually did the work. Really critical to start showing segregation of duties. Did the person who are making the changes, did they have the right permissions to do so? And then, as you talked about, an audit comes along. It isn't just simply, here's my process that I've done, leave me alone. It's showing attribution. It's showing proof that, hey, you followed. So then the critical nature then is, hey, Christine, now that you're being knocked and touched on the shoulder, how much work actually went into, right, being able to show that the process that you put in place is great, but now you have to actually attest to, hey, that you've actually followed your process. So tell me a little bit about how tedious that was.
So tedious and so painful. And I know that, you know, you and I both love this concept of a definition of done, which should be in place when we're doing our requirements gathering, if we're doing any sort of business analysis, as well as requirements gathering, as well as journey mapping, as well as user stories. You also need a definition of done. And that definition of done can also be used as your success criteria. How do you justify the benefits? Well, that should be the definition of done. What does it do for you at the end? And again, if we're using things like Excel, maybe we're using a custom object in Salesforce, to me, it always feels like we're forcing something that just doesn't belong there naturally. And I love Salesforce for custom objects. I've built lots and lots of custom objects that work just as I want to, but didn't work in the way I wanted necessarily for change requests. It feels like a bit of a round peg square hole situation where I'm trying to make it do something that it's not designed to do, and I can't replicate the functionality of a tool that is actually designed to do this, because there's so much more to it than we think about. It's not simply a change request. There are all the other parts that we've talked about as part of the strategy.
Yeah. So I guess when we're thinking about, you know, the steps and the tests, you know, start thinking about what does that look like, especially if you're using, you know, a complex data like CPQ or field service or things, because it's more and more as the complexity comes from Salesforce, there's going to be more and more opportunities for external auditors to start coming and give you that nice little surprise. So again, making sure that you harden your process. And then are you in a capability, you have the opportunities to start showing the actual work that's being done, you know, kind of behind the scenes. So as we talked about, you know, this complexity of the data, right, specifically CPQ and field service and other things, not just within audit, but there's a concept that developers have been using for a really long time around, you know, metadata. And how do they care for it? How are they using version control? And how do they really keep a really hardened process around making sure that code is actually versioned, right? Obviously, we've been doing this now, you know, 30, 40 years when coding really has started up. But there's a new kind of concept that's really, you know, that we're really pushing for, and that's that configuration data isn't necessarily any different, right, than say metadata. But I think in a lot of ways, individuals aren't necessarily thinking about configuration data or data like, you know, metadata. So what advice would you give our listeners if they're still using, you know, deployment, or they're not using deployment automation for configuration data, and they're still using like a data loader in Excel to kind of try to get all this stuff kind of prepared and going?
It's just making so much more work for yourself. And I think for a long time, I know that I've been campaigning for people to see metadata as important as data. And now I feel like we have this third wave as well, because now we're talking about what configuration data needs to be something that you think about as well. And one of the things I come back to quite a lot is the risk of human error, of manual error. So my background was working typically for global businesses. So they had businesses in different countries, different Salesforce orgs a lot of the time. And one of the things that I would need to think about is, does my deployment solution, or in fact any tool that I'm using, enable me to manage complex setups? So can I manage multiple orgs? Can I manage multiple clouds? If we think back to your example about something like CPQ, we need to think about the configuration changes that we've made to that. Where are they stored? How can we get to them? The more manual the process is, if we're using something like data loader, then it's constantly has to be redone, remapped, re-uploaded. The effort of putting data into your system using something like data loader and creating those relationships takes a lot of time. So I think it's really important to find a deployment tool that's going to help you automate as much as possible to reduce any bugs, any errors, and then all the extra benefits as well. Faster deployments. We've talked about sandbox seeding. Version control is so important. I mean, I know for me, that's been a real key thing, is knowing what happened, when it happened, the ability to roll back, because, you know, as we know, you can't roll back in Salesforce, in live, or in a sandbox. And so these things are all really, really important, especially if you are dealing with a very complex org, as you say, with CPQ, field service, lightning as well. It's really, really important. Do you have advice? You know, what advice does Prodly give to their customers?
I think that the advice is that use Prodly, right? And that's really the core of what we were built on, right? And it really is around, being able to move configuration data like metadata. But I think that the benefits of using a tool, an automation tool, is around templatizing, or being able to have that really, really complex data model already defined for you. Maybe not 100%, right? Because there's configurations and customizations, but something that gets you, a 90, 95%. Is if you think about the effort that it takes to be able to do this, right? And the efficiencies and the problems and all that you talked about. So having a well-hardened, defined way of doing this only brings heightened efficiencies. And if you've ever used data loader and using VLOOKUPs, and you know what we're talking about. And nobody should ever use those ever again, right? Because there are these well-hardened tools that I think give you the capabilities to be able to do this well, and be able to not only bring efficiencies within your day-to-day operations and saying, hey, I as a developer can work faster. But the one use case that I love to talk with our customers is the abilities to maybe get, and again, maybe more specifically around CPQ, but getting your pricing changes in faster. If you think about how long it would take you to do a certain price change, could be 20, 30 days, could be 60 days, could be 90 days. So now your business, from the time that they've made this decision, let's say they're going to do a 20% increase on their overall price book. Well, if it takes you 90 days, how many quotes and how many sales actually go out the door in that time that it has taken you to make those changes? Well, what if you had a tool that you could actually iterate from your lower environments into production within hours or days? Now, how many quotes did you actually get out the door? Now we're talking about real cost savings to your business, as we talk about, hey, we really need to be doing this, a lot more efficient fashion. So
I think that's a really interesting point that you make. Quite often people have to build a business case or a justification for additional spend on a tool. And I think that's probably much easier for a deployment solution than it maybe is for other types of solutions, because you can actually quantify time saved, hours saved, therefore salary saved, quotes sent out, how fast could you increase your quote to sale cycle. Yes. So it is something that you could definitely put together a good justification. And I think that it's always worth looking at what a tool offers as well, because sometimes when people think of a solution, they think of the main thing that it does. Mm-hmm. So perhaps when we think about deployment, we think about our sandbox strategy or version control, and we don't think about sandbox seeding, but that's also an important part of our strategy. So when we're looking at tools, we want to make sure that it's doing everything we need it to do. Yep. And look at other use cases where we can justify how we're going to get value out of this tool.
Yeah, absolutely. And maybe going off script a little bit, right? And when we talk about application lifecycle management and DevOps, test is another key feature, right? That it's like, hey, if we're going to streamline the development and the release, well, what about test? And when you talk about CPQ, what better way than to use regression testing to be able to see, hey, are the pricing that I'm putting in is actually impacting? So having a tool that not only has the abilities to really rush that through, but making sure that what you're actually getting through is actually quality, and that you're not making changes that the business is going to not want, post. So again, having a tool that not only looks at those, but also looking at something around testing and regression testing, specifically around CPQ, I think is really critical. So
yeah,
so good. All right, well, this is really great discussions, and kind of just to wrap up, and kind of what I've heard around the 5 tips, and that's really what we were getting to within the overall session, is invest in a deployment automation. I think what we just talked about in getting efficiencies, not just within the getting through all the service requests that you have and being able to do that faster, or making your development team more efficient in what they're doing. But we're leaving money on the table, especially around CPQ, when we say, hey, there's real money to be gained when we say, hey, we can get pricing changes out the door faster. And applications are only becoming even more complex with CPQ and field service and many, many, many other applications that are in there. For the second tip was sandbox management and data seeding strategies, to reduce product defects and issues when developing out of sync from production, right? This is probably the most important one, is if your overall strategies is not on a cadence that is well efficient, and that you're moving automation and data and you're getting it seeded, it's probably something that you should really look into, and utilizing some automation tools like Prodly to really help you get the data where it needs to be. And that way you're actually developing in production-like environments, right? I don't know that we necessarily said that very loud, but I think it's critical. If your development environments are not in sync with your production and you're making those changes, basically what you're doing is hoping and praying that when you produce when you promote those to production, that you hope that they work, that the changes don't impact something that maybe you didn't have in your lower environment. So making sure that your right strategies for your organizations and you have the right processes in place to be able to seed that data. Formalize a change management process, thinking about the entire application lifecycle management, not just DevOps. As we talked about, what does that mean, right? We're talking about plan, build, test, release, and monitor, but it's all aspects of the lifecycle to make sure that your processes are hardened. And then you integrate that entire change management process, right? So now you're talking about linking not only the incidents, whether, Christine, you put it in Salesforce, right? Or you're using maybe a more seasoned ITSM tool like a ServiceNow or whatnot, but really integrating that and making sure that your tickets are kind of linked together, not only from the change request itself, but to the service request or the user story, so maybe in Jira, and then actually linking that to the deployment itself. And basically what we're talking about is setting yourself up for when that external auditor comes knocking and tapping on your shoulder like you had, right? 2 hours to start justifying why changes were made. We have that process that's kind of already in place. And it's really easy to now start pulling together the evidence that's required to say, hey, here's my process, here's all the information, the who, the what, and the why, and we can build that story up really, really fast. The fourth is start thinking about your process for compliance and audit, right? And this is kind of what we just talked about. But what I'm hearing, right, in the marketplace is that, in our customer base, is that because Service Cloud and CPQ is becoming part of that financial system, so if you are using CPQ, and hopefully auditors aren't listening to this call and I just set you guys up for audit, but it's becoming a little bit more and more on the radar. So you might as well have your processes hardened and ready for compliance and attestation. So, and then the fourth or the fifth, and I think that this is one that IT organizations struggle with, I think, a lot, and that's introduce ROI and time savings in the planning requirement stage, right? And I think, and again, we get so busy, we get so enamored with trying to just get the tickets out the door because we have so many tickets. But really implementing and bringing focus to the requirements, to the business analyst to kind of put that. And Christine, I love your advice and having a place to actually store that. And dare I say, make that a requirement so that tickets can't go through. And what better way to have governance in place is to use that, right, as one of the decision points for prioritization to say, hey, how impactful is this into the business? Is this impacting a single team? And if it is a single team, that's fine, but how much value are we really going to bring to them? So I guess, again, going maybe a little off script. So as we kind of wrap up, Christine, what last bit of advice as we look through these 5 tips of efficient Salesforce development would you give to our listeners?
So I think for me, the 5th point that we're showing on the screen here about keeping track of ROI and time-saving metrics. I know that one of the questions we've had is around people that struggle to get buy-in, struggle to get people to actually use the change request process. And it's like anything, it's just like using Salesforce. User adoption is critical. And you need a solid business case for getting this kind of tool. But if you've built a solid business case with your anticipated metrics for time saved and cost savings, then you have a good business case to get your senior executives to help you with getting that buy-in. It can't always just come from the developer or the administrator. We need to get exec buy-in as well, so that from the top down, everyone knows that this is the process and this is how it has to be done. It's got to be done for so many reasons. Compliance is just one of them, but that is a good example to use to get that buy-in, to get the business telling their teams, this is what we're going to do now, and this is why.
No, it's good. That's great. That's great. All right. Well, I guess, now that kind of ends kind of the 5 tips, and now we're going into kind of the Q&A session. So I'm not sure, Christine or Shannon, or who's taking over kind of the Q&A portion.
So we do have a question for you, Scott, which was about version control.
Yeah.
So you talked about using version control for config data. When would you recommend that to your prospects or customers?
I would recommend that everybody use it when you think about configuration data, right? Now, version control for data isn't a replacement for backup and recovery, right? And then backup and recovery is really around transactional data. It's the massive amounts of making sure that in an emergency you can come back. But when you think about configuration data, right, you never would want to be without version control if you're working on code. Code changes an awful lot, and it happens really, really fast, and you have multiple individuals working through that. So if you think about the use case for why version control for metadata, the exact same use case can be applied to version control for data, and the urgency around if you haven't and you're not using it, and you're using applications that are really heavy in configuration data, and it's likely you should be thinking about how do you do it today. We have one customer that's really heavy in using QCP, and the what they showed us, right? This calculator was this hundreds and hundreds of lines of code, and it literally is stored in a text field, right? And it's huge and it's long. And the process around control of that is to make a copy, create another line item in the database, and store that. Well, then he makes changes. What happens if he names them wrong? Well, what happens if things get out of sort? What happens if one of those goes away? That's his version and that's his history, right? This was a crazy concept. And we're like, listen, there's got to be a better way to actually store that. And version control for data, as we think about version for metadata, is exactly where it should be doing. So I guess, long story short, if you're not thinking about version control for data, I highly suggest that you start thinking about that. And if you don't have a tool that's using it, I say reach out to us and we'll have more conversations about it.
Do you think there are people who may be under the impression that there are tools within Salesforce they can use? So, for example, the system audit trail is one of the ones that we talk about with Salesforce, where we can go and track certain changes, configuration changes as opposed to data changes. Have you come across anyone who thinks that that is enough, that gives them enough of a trail?
I haven't, because I think there's too many limitations in what we're really talking about and the complexities that are there. And a lot of the data fields specifically around CPQ aren't available for that. So when you're thinking about the breadth of changes, I don't think it's heavy and I don't think it's enough. And again, if I'm willing to have more conversations around why you feel like that is enough, but I can't see. And again, through the complexities of what's going on, that would be enough to actually control. And I think it's costly, because now you're talking about the way that it's stored, and it's not versioned very well. So
yeah, no, I completely agree.
And using a well-seasoned repo solution, right? Not to drop names, but there are plenty that are out there that are really doing repository and merge right now. And again, version control isn't just about the storing of, and I guess maybe here's the argument that should be applied, but it's around branching strategy and merge conflicts. So as you're thinking about, if you have multiple individuals that are doing these types of code changes or metadata, or configuration type data, how do you ensure that you're not overlapping each other and overwriting each other's changes? That's where a repository solution comes in, because now we're starting to talk about branching strategies and conflict resolutions, and having a really great release process that brings all of them together into one.
Yeah. And if I could ask you a question, Scott,
Please.
which I'm a bit curious about. Is there one thing, like one tip that you could give people when they're looking for this type of tool that they may not have considered? And let me give you a bit of an example. I was looking at backup solutions, and something I wasn't aware of is the speed of backups differ between providers. That hadn't even crossed my mind, so I didn't know to look at it until someone pointed it out to me. And then I was a bit gobsmacked because, you know, there's a big difference between 2 hours and 2 months to get all your data back. So I just wonder if there's something that maybe Prodly does that people should be looking for that they might not know to look for.
Yeah, I think it's one of our biggest secrets, right? That I don't know that I celebrate loud enough, but it really is our abilities and the infrastructure and the way that we're designed for data templates. When you think about the complexities of the data model, of not just CPQ, I know that our use case, our origin story, if you will, starts with Max, Redmond and Steelbricks, and selling to Salesforce and becoming CPQ. But our product isn't built for CPQ, right? It's built with the idea of having the infrastructure to be able to move complex data regardless of what that is, and having the ability to create reusable templates to be able to do that. So as you're thinking about configuration data, if you're buying a solution that's maybe hard-coded or written for a single solution, you're only going to be able to use that tool for that thing, instead of using a tool that's actually set up for whatever data that you have, whether configuration data, right, or the metadata, being flexible to be able to move at the speed of business itself.
Yeah, I like that. And actually, that should be a familiar concept to a lot of people. When we think about Salesforce, we think about streamlining our tech stack, of bringing everything together, of using Salesforce for many different things. So it makes sense then that if we're building upon that any other tool we look at should also be a comprehensive solution.
Absolutely, absolutely. Is that all of our questions?
I think so.
I believe so, yes.
Perfect.
All right. Thank you, Scott. Thank you, Christine, so much. Thank you for joining us today. If there are any questions arising from this afterwards, don't hesitate to reach out. And otherwise, thank you all for joining and wishing you a really good day.
Yes, thanks, Christine.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.